The Nintendo GameCube, proclaimed by many to be the greatest console of all time, now in the palm of your hands. This is a kitted mod called the G-Boy, which many of you are probably already aware of. I'm so late to the game on this one that at the time of making this video, you can't even buy a kit anymore, with all product pages being defunct. Fingers crossed that it's only a supply chain related issue and can come back someday. I referred to this unit as a GameCube, but really that comes through backwards compatibility of the Nintendo Wii, which is what is actually inside this thing. Real hardware, no emulation, and that's what makes the G-Boy special. In this video, I'll assemble the G-Boy from start to finish following the bit-built guides, which I'll provide a link to in the video description. If this product comes back on market, I hope this content can be a useful supplement to the written instructions. And if not, well, at least I had fun. Now let's get started. This mod requires, for lack of a better word, destroying a Nintendo Wii, at least in its original form, which is why my candidate is a cheap garage sale pickup that is in perfectly rough aesthetic shape to not feel too bad about it. First thing they say is to make sure you have a more modern 4-layer circuit board, and you can determine this by checking a number on the board within the battery compartment. In this case, the number is 20, which indicates it's an older 6-layer board. I'm just gonna go ahead and proceed anyway. I mean, it should probably be fine, right? We have to hook it up and soft mod the system by installing the homebrew channel and RV loader with VGA enabled. The latter part is specific to modding for handhelds. The process can be a little awkward and requires both an SD card and a flash drive, but it's all covered in the bit-built guide. When that's taken care of, I test a game that I own to make sure I can successfully boot a game from the USB drive before moving on. Now it's time to retrieve the circuit board from the console. The Wii is probably the most annoying Nintendo console to work on because it has so many different screw types with little indication of where they should go. Luckily, we don't have to reassemble this, which is where you would feel that type of pain. Tearing it down alone isn't too bad when you don't have to keep track of where all the screws need to go. With the board out, it's time to trim it to the shape that includes all required parts and maintains the correct size for the handheld form factor. I lament because it is indeed true that the old 6-layer circuit boards will not work here. The spacing of essential components on the older boards is different, meaning when I trim it down, it will not fit in the shell. I guess I need to get a new Wii. For me, that could be months. For you, it'll be like half a second. I have a new Wii, and have confirmed it is a newer 4-layer board. At this point, since the preceding processes are exactly the same, I'll skip the modding and teardown and go straight to trimming down the circuit board with this new unit. I've outlined the circuit board region needed for the handheld mod, so it's time to harvest it. What I'm doing now is haphazardly removing components that are in my way. That, combined with this next part, is what I was talking about earlier when I said we need to destroy the Wii. This piece constitutes the brains of the handheld, but after trimming, I'm a bit worried I cut too deep on this one side. I went straight through these 3 components, which I noticed after the fact are still intact on the next steps of the bit build guide. My suspicion is that I'm still good to go. We'll find out later. I'll sand down the rough edges to ensure we don't have any shorts between the layers of the PCB. I'll also cut out another small segment of the board containing the MX chip and U10 component that we'll need a bit later. With the main board segment trimmed and cleaned up, this U5 chip and surrounding components need to be removed. Adding excess solder is quite helpful in removing these. With that area cleaned up, it's time to remove the U10 chip from the smaller board region we excised earlier. Same method as before to remove it. And now it gets placed in the earlier U5 location, noting that we need to bridge the front 3 pins adjacent to C6. Now to solder a fine wire to this GPU pin and thread the other end through this via to attach to the leg of U10. Here's what that looks like when we zoom out. Last item for board prep is removing this LDO chip. We'll use a side cutter to trim the first pin, then reflow the solder joint to pull it out. And it's the same process for the remaining pins. With the pins out of the way, I bust apart the top of the chip to reduce its thermal mass and make it easier to desolder this large pad. Now we'll remove the solder and get everything nice and clean. And with that, the board preparation is complete. Let's move on to the G-Boy components. The first step on the back shell is to put the shoulder buttons into place, as well as this tiny Z button. Then the button board goes down. Shoulder buttons click, so we move on. Now placing the power button and USB board. Everything is fitting together pretty well so far. 2 of the 4 battery terminals shoot straight in with enough gusto. However, the ones adjacent to the shell radii must be cut down for proper fitment. Next up, we secure the power board with 4 screws. Off camera, the main power connections are made using 22 gauge stranded wire. And from here on, I'll be sparse in videoing the actual soldering, but in regards of what's important, we'll be showing the finished connections. I put the heatsink in here, but you really don't need to yet. Wire management entails we weave the fan wires under the USB and power boards before soldering it. After that, 6 tight-knit connections are made between the USB and power boards, using larger 22 gauge wire for charge and ground, and smaller 30 gauge wire for the other connections. I use black wire across the board here, but if you have other colors, definitely utilize that to keep track of things more easily. Now we'll do a couple quick tests. Popping in an 18650 battery and holding the power button down for a second should make the fan kick on, and it does, as you can see by it blowing out this flame. So we'll turn it off again, plug in the flash drive containing a micro SD, then connect it to the computer via USB-C. And success! We are able to access the files. Last thing I'll check for now is the charge pin voltage, which is showing 5 volts, so we're good to move on. Next up is the screen, where we need to apply this bezel sticker to start. Folding the edges over, it looks pretty decent. The screen drops into the front shell, followed by this bracket, which is fastened down. And the board is fastened right after. It looks decent, so I'll reapply that liner to protect it in the following steps. The DS Lite buttons, which are not included in the kit, go in next. One of the rubber membranes needs to be cut out in the center to fit properly in the shell. Then we insert the start button, and the corresponding board can be fastened down. Joysticks are up next, and they just pop in and get fastened with these 3D printed crossbars. Making the joystick connections to the board should look roughly like this. Make sure everything feels normal, and we're in good shape. Then we can place the speakers and secure the audio board. Next up is installing the light polarizer, and then the LED board, which just takes a single screw. Now we'll move on to the final wiring processes and integrating the Wii motherboard. On the screen board, we need to remove this capacitor for the next wiring step. When that's done and cleaned up, we'll line the shell halves adjacent to one another for soldering the 5-volt lines between the power and screen boards using 22 gauge wire. And here's what that looks like when it's done. Next up, we need to solder 4 lines for the LED with 30 gauge wire. My wire color options aren't unique, so not great, but here's what it looks like now. Some strain relief is provided by laying down a piece of Kapton tape over the 4 wires here. A quick test indicates the LED is working, so we can move on. Back to the Wii board, this capacitor column needs to be removed, so let's take care of that. Earlier I mentioned some concern about trimming too deep on one edge of the board, and this concern was valid, not because of these 3 chips, but because of the traces up here I cut through, which I've since re-established off camera in this wire grouping. Big thanks to Crazy Gadget on the BitBuilt forums for giving the advice I needed on this one, and pointing out that they are necessary for this build. Next up, we'll remove some liners from the copper strip and heatsink, and then mate them together. Bringing our attention back to the Wii board, the power lines are soldered next. First, we'll connect the 3.3 volt and ground. This is the 1.15 volt line, this is the 1 volt line, and this is the 1.8 volt line. Next, the video connections are made with this purple and orange wire pair, followed by the USB connection made with the fine 34 gauge wire in these locations. A quick and important note is that I had an error on the screen power wiring previously where both were connected to the 5 volt line. I've remedied that, and now the blue wire is properly grounded. I also found that the additional ground line made earlier with this fine orange wire was causing me problems, as in the screen was not turning on. So I just disconnected it to get things back on track. With those corrections made, I'm getting a picture on the screen, and that's great to see. Moving on, we'll start connecting 3.3 volt to the controller and then the following signal lines with this group of green wires. Last item on the controller is running a fine wire from here over to the Wii board on this pin. Now we'll apply thermal paste to these chips on the Wii and fasten down the board. Whoops! I had to open it back up to attach this 1.8 volt wire for audio. I weave it down under here and connect it over to the audio board along with these blue and yellow wires, which go to the button board. Moving on to audio, the fine wire connections here are pretty tricky, but here's how mine look when it's finished. And a quick test shows we're good on the speaker. I'm holding Z and Y with D-pad inputs to adjust the volume. Now the thermistor, which is used for overtemp protection, is soldered and we'll tape it down. Lastly, I wire up VGA to improve picture quality. These fine wires up here on the Wii go over to the upper left connector pins on the screen. Furthermore, it was necessary to connect this TP47 mode pin to 3.3 volts, which affords VGA switching. Now let's fasten everything together and confirm if what we did was good. Success! Everything is working normally, and while the display isn't the greatest, the picture still looks quite good through VGA. I don't know about y'all, but 12-year-old me would freak out if he saw this thing. Do you like the G-Boy Peach? I think she's undecided. Well, that's all I've got for today, everyone. The G-Boy is a fantastic mod, and it's very impressive what the creators were able to accomplish here. I truly hope it makes a comeback so that more people can experience it. As always, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of this one in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you liked what you saw. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.